And we're live again. So I think last time we ended with the writer, right? So I can probably scroll down quite a bit.
Bit more.
So I'm too far. Here we go.
Actually, I wanted to ask you, do you think it might make sense to give a recap of the CBOR spec, like just an overview, or is that not necessary?
Well, we did that last time, right? So like the nice thing with YouTube is people can watch the previous one if they want to.
Of course.
So given that we all said this might take 2.5 meetings, I would just use the time for the API review.
Fair enough. Okay then. So CBOR reader. As mentioned last week, CBOR reader is basically a class. Again, stateful forward-only reader. So I'm just gonna start going through the sort of main methods, starting with the constructors. Well, it's basically only one constructor. It accepts read-only memory containing the CBOR encoding to be read. It accepts a CBOR conformance mode, enum, which defaults to strict. Just a reminder, strict mode is validating for duplicate keys in the map and also validating UTF-8 strings, apart from just basic well-formed-ness of the CBOR document. And also, like the writer, it accepts a Boolean allow multiple root level values, which also defaults to false. That's about it. It will throw, I didn't include this, but it will throw, obviously, if the CBOR conformance mode is not one of the defined values. That's about it, really. Okay, should I move on?
I'm thinking. So why do you take a read-only memory and not something like a byte array or something?
Well, I mean, byte array is a special case of read-only memory, isn't it?
But there's no implicit class, right? You would have to know how to construct a memory from a byte array, right?
Yeah. So are you asking if there should be an overload accepting byte array?
I mean, I don't know exactly what the scenarios are, but I would think most people will probably have that data either as a stream or as a byte array. If they have it as a stream, they know how to get a byte array. I'm not sure anybody knows how to do a read-only memory over a byte array necessarily. Or worst case, they have a stream and then try to figure out how to go from stream directly to read-only memory.
I mean, read-only memories or byte arrays implicitly convert to read-only memory of byte.
Yeah.
Oh, they do. They're good. I mean,
F# has to use as memory, but.
I mean, the question is whether people know that too, but yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I kind of made the assumption that everybody knows how to do that, and it's calling as memory in case you don't rely on implicit conversions.
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly add the byte array overload.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the problem with taking the array, or with taking the memory in a constructor, we've said that ownership, or that the caller is responsible of maintaining the value until the object they pass it to in a constructor is out of scope. With a byte array input, we don't have clear answers of, are we treating it as functional? Are we making a defensive copy? Are you responsible for preserving the data during the lifetime of the object you passed it to? And I think that's why we skipped it in ASN Reader. We came up with some rules, hand-wavy rules, for memory, but we don't have rules for array because we're just all over the place with what we do with arrays. But we can do whatever.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we do this intentionally. I mean, it's a specialized API, so I don't care too much. But I would normally think if you want to make it usable, we would at least have an overload.
Okay.
Because I think most people will probably have the data in some. I mean, even if they don't have it as a byte array, they can usually relatively easy to figure out how to do that. I understand why you don't take stream. That makes sense. The rest makes sense to me.
Yeah, as mentioned, like this is intentionally not taking stream for the same reasons that Seaborn writer doesn't write to stream. Namely, it needs to have access to all the data at all times for validation reasons.
Right. So I will scroll in a sec. There we go.
There are a few properties that we skipped.
Oh, did we? I thought you mentioned them already.
No. Well, I mean, the first three of them are, well, two of them are echoing just the parameters that were passed to the constructor.
Right.
Then there's current depth that, self-explanatory. It returns the context depth of the reader. Then there are two properties, and I actually have a criticism for the API I'm myself proposing here. So one is returning bytes read, which is the number of bytes that have been read, which is echoing the bytes written property that exists in Seaborn writer. And then there's a second property called has data, which is a Boolean, which indicates basically whether there's more data in the buffer to read. I would myself, this is what exists in the code base, but I would recommend maybe replacing those two with bytes remaining. So basically have a sort of symmetric property to the bytes written property in Seaborn writer, and this would be used to determine both whether there exists data and whether the number of the bytes that have been read. Does that make sense?
In this reader, how nested scopes are the same reader. You don't return new objects, right?
Correct.
Okay, because the ASN reader has data because the way that the nesting works, the best model was to return a new reader, and so it's telling you when you're draining that segment out. But if you don't have a similar scenario here, then what you said makes sense.
Okay, so proposal here is to replace the two properties with bytes remaining.
And bytes remaining is returning an int, I suppose, right?
Yeah, correct.
So basically bytes read and has data should be collapsed into byte remaining. All right.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk about peaking. Peaking obviously is just the methods that the reader uses to look ahead in the current data without actually advancing the state. There is one primary method that does this called peak state, and it returns an enum applicable to Seaborn reader state. So I'm just gonna go through all the possible states returned by the enumeration here. Basically, there's the none state, which will never be returned by the Seaborn reader. We basically just use this to populate the zero value so that default is not occupied by a valid state. We called it none. Then it's just going through the Seaborn major types. So major type 0, unsigned integer, negative integer, major type 1, definite length byte string, start byte string for indefinite length byte string, end byte string, determining the length of the end of an indefinite length byte string, text string for definite length UTF-8 string, start text string for the start of an indefinite length text string, and similarly end text string for the end of an indefinite length text string. Start array denoting obviously the start of an array, major type 4, either definite length or indefinite length. End array, similarly, denoting the end of an array. Start map, denoting the start of a map, and end map denoting the end of a map. Tag for major type 6. Could you scroll down, please? Simple value for simple values in major type 7. Then you have the 3 floating point types: half precision, single precision float, and double precision float. And then I have a few additional states specializing simple values that are useful. So if your if your simple value happens to be null, that will be returned as a specific state, and the same applies to Boolean. Finished, denoting that, well, the reader has completed reading a full CBOR document. I should probably also state the remark here that essentially if you only allow a single root level document but the buffer still contains trailing bytes, this will still be the state returned by the peek method. End of data, indicating that the CBOR document has completed abruptly, and format error for all other kinds of format errors. Me and Jeremy were actually debating whether those should be collapsed to one single state. I kind of felt that we might need to keep a separate one for end of data, but it's up to you guys what you think.
So my question I have is, you mentioned like definite and indefinite. How do I know whether when I'm at, let's say, at start text string, how do I know that it's always indefinite? I see what you're saying.
Yeah. I suppose you're asking about array. So start array might denote either a definite length or an indefinite length.
So how do I know?
So in that case, in both cases, you would call read start array, and it would return a nullable integer. So if it is inhabited, then it would be definite length. If it's null, it would be indefinite length.
I see. So the length itself is never a state I'm at, basically.
Correct.
Right.
That makes sense. Okay.
And the idea in this one is like what the JSON reader does, is the peek state essentially tells you which method or methods are legal to call next.
Right.
So start array, whether it was definite or indefinite, only has one method that you would call, so it didn't need to. There's no benefit in distinguishing the state. But I think start byte array has a method that you're allowed to call that byte array does not. If I'm recalling 3 pages ahead correctly. So sometimes there's overlap. But this is giving you an idea of what's the best method to call.
Yeah. In general, I would say that the reader doesn't make any attempts to, coerce data. So like if you're trying to read a float and the underlying value is an integer, then it will throw an invalid operation exception. So generally, this is pretty rigid, and the state will basically guide you to essentially the only method that you are able to call to advance the reader state.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have a simpler question, which will make everyone happy. Why is it none and not undefined? If you say it's for indicating there's an undefined state and defaulting to that, why call it none?
I don't really have any strong opinions, to be honest. I think we kind of went through 3 different names and ended up with none.
Undefined seems fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess none is just because the vast majority of enums happen to use none, but like I don't care either.
All right, undefined it is.
Yeah, because none state means it's null versus a blank. So I think undefined is just a little bit more specific.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's funny how sometimes performance can completely fuck you up. Like I I'm now at the point where every time I type, it takes like 2 seconds for the character to appear. So it's not just performance that is annoying, it just really messes with your mental state of what you're doing. Alright, so then let's scroll past this guy.
Yeah, and obviously at the end of that, there's the signature of the peak state method. I would assume pretty self-explanatory. This method will never throw. So.
Except it does right now.
Yeah, except it does in that particular instance.
So any reason why this is a method, not a property, I would assume that you're like, I mean, it seems it's the current state of the reader, right? Like, are you doing work every time I call you?
It will, yeah, it will do work. It will read 1 byte ahead from the buffer. So there is a small amount of parsing effort, but we're also caching that so that we can call it many times. I think that a method better communicates this. And I think the other thing is a property might confuse people into believing that this is something that has been read, whereas a method indicates that is something that lies ahead more clearly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, to me as a property, it feels a little weird because it's updated by side effects of calling other read methods, and the fact that it's not just reading like the top 3 bits and reporting the major type. It's in some of them doing more complicated things to figure out which more precise thing it wants to do. So it is definitely not just a memory read or a field return fast, but it's also not computing the 100th digit of pi.
Yeah, maybe I'm misremembering this, but I think on XML Reader it was a property. I guess. I guess my mental model is just like, I don't know. I mean, probably would help to see some sample code again because I don't remember it. But like, I think normally when I write a loop, like the typical reader loop where you basically switch over the state, I would probably first look at properties before I even look at methods. I mean, in your case, it might not matter because you only have so many methods, but I guess in your case, you have a decent amount of methods, right? Because you have 1 per data item that can be there. So, yeah, it just seems odd to me because I would normally assume like you instantiate the reader, you're standing on some state, and then you're switching from there, and then you're calling method A, B, and C, right? But the sample code was way up, right? Let me just open a new tab so we don't have to fight the scroll bars.
Yeah, you said you're currently memoizing it, Eric?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it could be a property.
I see. So this is basically what to call, so you don't bother with this state.
Well, he did have a peak state in there of checking the end in reading a map.
Oh yeah, here we go.
Yeah. He didn't have the giant switch statement of do a generic object particle emitter, but
yeah, I guess it's hard to see like what ends up happening, right? If it's a reader dot, like how many things show up, right?
Well, it's mostly methods starting with the word read, and then you have everything else.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, what would you call it as a property? Just state?
Probably.
What about next state?
Next state is what I was thinking. That would, if we want to play the IntelliSense game, it would also bump it above all the R's. So.
Doesn't sound too bad. But
I guess to me it doesn't really matter what you name it because it will be distinct anyway. But
I guess peak is already above read. So
maybe it's fine. I mean,
I kind of, I tend to look at properties, from an IEnumerator approach. So like .current represents something that has already been read. So that was my primary misgiving to converting this to a property.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you mean by that, right? I mean, the way I see state is like it's basically communicating what you're supposed to do next. And the way I think about it is more like lazily computed, right? But yeah, I guess.
Which it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't care for method or the other one. It's just intuition, I guess.
Yeah, I think next state wouldn't be too confusing, a name for a property.
Okay, let me just record it under consider because I don't feel strongly one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, next does have the slight oddity of like, while the next state is not done, it's like, well, but I want the state now to be done.
Actually, before we go ahead, are there any serious opinions on the sort of end of data versus format error being collapsed?
I mean, what does format error indicate? Like, what would I do when I see that?
In this case, it's basically nondescript in the sense that the reader doesn't know which method you should be calling even in the first place.
Yeah, I guess my question, I mean, is that so basically it indicates that the underlying CBOR format is invalid.
Correct.
So why not just
It is. Sorry.
So why not just throw?
It could.
Well, if it throws, it definitely shouldn't be a property.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess that's my question. Like, why would we return the state rather than blowing up? Because it seems like.
So I need to look up the implementation to remember for which cases we actually throw, but fundamentally it is just not well-formed CBOR. But yeah, I'll consider it definitely.
I mean, you throw for other cases, no?
In the read methods, definitely.
Yeah, because I mean, I understand end of data as a subset of the document is corrupt based on the fact that you've read like 3 start arrays. You shouldn't, especially if they were indefinite, you shouldn't have hit the end of the payload without seeing the end markers. And so that's like, hey, you gave me truncated data, we're broken. And that's something you can diagnose. And I assume that format error is any other problem, and that that the reason that you wanted to break out end of data is because that is a specific diagnosable problem.
Oh, I think I misread what end of data means then. I thought it just means you're literally done with the document. But you're saying whenever you see end of data, it's also a problem because the thing terminated
That's
in the
a good point, because what your interpretation is basically what the finished state denotes. So
yes,
that might indicate that this might be a source of confusion.
Yeah. We could call it unexpected end of data.
Yeah. Or incomplete. I mean, that might also be fine.
I mean, the implementation does have a throw mode, and if you actually threw, then the exception message would, indicate the precise error in a way that an enum couldn't do that. So maybe we should just make it throw for those cases.
I mean, same for end of data though. Like, why would we not throw when you have an incomplete document?
We could.
I mean, like, what would the handling be? Like, what would I do differently, right? It seems like in both cases, you're just like, sorry, dude, I can't parse your document.
Basically.
Like, you can't really recover from either of them, right?
Nope.
So.
Okay. Fair enough. So it stays a method and it throws.
I mean, the message should probably say what the problem is, just as an FYI, but like, it seems more like that's for the troubleshooter who has to figure out whether the data is corrupted.
When I was writing this initially, I ended up with like 15 different error enum states, and we were like, maybe we shouldn't use an enum for that. But sounds like we shouldn't be using an enum for invalid CBOR at all.
Yeah, because once you have it, I mean, people will ask for more states, right?
Yeah.
And then it just
Okay.
becomes more and more complicated.
Okay. So reader methods. So the general shape of read methods is of the form type, read type, and some arguments. The read methods will either successfully decode the requested value or throw an exception and not advance the reader state. So starting with integer values, which are measure types 0 and 1. Just a reminder, measure type 0 is the unsigned integer. Measure type 1 is the negative integer type. So first we have the signed integer reader methods. So read int32 and read int64. Basically, they can throw three kinds of exceptions. You have invalid operation exception in cases where you are basically trying to read. Basically, the underlying data is not matching the measure type that you requested. Overflow exception can be thrown if the value is too large to fit in the return types. Format exception can be thrown for a variety of reasons, whether the underlying data is invalid. There was an unexpected dead end of CBOR data, which is essentially the same thing. And then the third case is that it is valid, but actually it doesn't fit under the current conformance level.
Right. So at this point, let's have a discussion of format exception. So the description of format exception, like just the short one is, exception is thrown when the format of an argument is invalid or when a composite format string is not well formed. I agree that we do want an exception for the CBOR is broken, but format exception to me feels like it's very intimately tied to two-string format codes and parse, so undoing two-string, and that we want some other exception here.
I mean, it seems generally. I mean, that's the pattern we have everywhere else, right? We have a JSON exception, we have an XML exception. It seems like that should probably be a CBOR exception or something.
Yeah, I made ASN content exception.
So basically, a CBOR exception and everything we throw derives from that, or just for the format exception?
Just for the format exception.
Okay.
Like invalid operation it's self-described. Overflow is self-described, but format exception is tied to parse and two-string.
Okay.
And so
Yeah, basically, the way to think about it is that it's just anything that's specific to the CBOR format, right? Like an overflow is not specific to CBOR. That's just physics. Correct. When it comes to ints.
Yeah.
And then I would say the same thing for invalid operation. Is just you're misusing the API, right? That's not specific to CBOR. This happens to be the CBOR API that you're misusing, but like the error condition is read the docs, right? And I think in this case, it's like, yeah, you gave me an invalidly or not a well-formed CBOR document, right? So, and that seems like for any error that you have, like the previous one we talked about, like the end of data and format error should probably be also throwing CBOR exceptions.
Okay. Do you have any opinions in terms of which exception type it should inherit from?
Exception.
Yeah.
Just exception. Okay.
Yeah.
So no format exception or anything like that. Okay.
Like every time you pick an existing exception, the way to think about this is, does it make sense if existing catch handlers will handle your exception? The answer is probably no. I mean,
fair enough.
Unless they're catching exception, right? In which case, they literally set any exception.
Would you expect any refinements on that particular type, or just one single exception with a string would be sufficient?
I think that's sufficient for now. Like, I mean, we can always add new derived types later. That's not a breaking change, right? Because you're basically just allowing people to catch more specific errors.
Okay. So any other feedback on the first two methods? Okay, so then we have the unsigned integer methods, which are major type 0. Again, from an exception perspective, it behaves exactly the same way as the previous methods, and it returns uint or unsigned int or unsigned long. Then finally, there's the esoteric, intentionally long name called read CBOR negative integer encoding, which explicitly decodes major type 1 negative encodings, and it complements the dual method that exists in the writer. So it returns an assigned long, which corresponds to -1 minus the integer, because internally CBOR uses that transformation for negative integer encoding. And again, it behaves pretty much the same way with respect to exceptions.
What's the reason for having encoding at the end of that method name when nothing, read in 32, read in 64, and then you're not really reading the encoding, you're reading, this returns a negative, does it not?
The return value is an unsigned integer, so it's not a negative integer by any standard. So I decided to call it negative integer encoding because it's an encoding of a negative number per the CBOR spec.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, it'll return a positive number, which represents probably a very, very negative number. Like
what?
A number that if you figured out how to build it into big integer would be less than long.minval.
Yep.
And essentially, it is, in the case that you need to call it, it's just returning effectively the next 8 bytes. As I didn't understand this, you deal with it.
Yep. Barry has a point though, right? If you would just call it read CBOR negative integer, like the argument still stands, right? You're basically returning a CBOR negative integer, and that happens to be in the format of a ulong, right?
Yeah.
The problem is in
don't
.NET
really
encoding
expect
means
it
something
more
specific,
complex.
right? That's, I think, the problem here.
Yeah.
But that's
personally, I don't know that anyone would ever call this, and I think we could probably cut it from reader and writer, and it's just esoteric. Use the data injection.
I'm sure if we did that, then someone would want to call it. I have certain people in mind that like to do esoteric weird ass things with
Maybe, but
encoding and signing. Hi, Kevin, if you're watching, who may end up wanting this at some point.
Effectively, this is somebody wants a 65-bit long, right? Like it's I need one more bit.
Why are you making me hard?
I should say that the naming is intentionally meant to scare people away from using it.
That doesn't work on Kevin. I tried. I think having an escape hatch generally makes sense for these kind of APIs. And I think you succeeded already in having a long name, which is already like, okay, you have to read the docs, right? Like, this is not the casual API that does what you think it does. So I guess I can live with and without encoding. Like, even if you drop encoding, the word is still sufficiently long to make people want to read.
Representation?
Well, that works. That works.
Yeah.
And at some point, my VS Code
it makes it even longer, which is good.
Yeah, the real question is, do you think it here and in the writer is going to be common enough that someone will need it?
I think it
therefore
will.
That it needs the public API instead of that they use the give me the bytes representing the next value and I'll deal with it myself.
As far as I know, there's no such method.
You didn't add something like a peak encoded?
No.
Okay, in which case it's needed for that. So,
would it be better to have a give me a bunch of bytes than just this?
Well, those bytes, because CBOR documents can be arbitrarily large. What you get back, you'd still need to read somehow.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, what will? So if you have this and the one on the writer. This needs a sample of showing how to deal with the big integer version of it to like, you read this and now here's how you move it into big integer, which is probably just big integer minus 1, or the -1 big integer minus this value, but it's still like, what do you do with it and how do you turn it into a number that you can make sense with, given that it almost by definition doesn't fit in a long.
So what's the conclusion? Should we add this fallback thingy or should we just rename the method?
I have no opinion either way.
I mean, the problem with like the general method, I have no idea whether that's easily doable, but it seems to me it's kind of like a layer of an escape hatch here, which I'm not sure how easy that would be to model entirely. Like, how many bytes do you return? Like the entirety of the remaining document, or the next 12 bytes, or?
Well, I mean, in this case, I think, if there was a like peak next value or peak next encoded value type thing, I would expect that for this one it would return on the average case 9 bytes, which would be the initial byte saying it had 8 bytes to go, and it was a negative number, and here are the 8 content bytes associated with it. But maybe that's just something that made more sense for ASN reader, where there's a separation of the data type tag, the length, and then the value.
Even if you got those bytes and you read them as a big endian long representation, you'd still need to, once you parse that, you'd still need to make the transformation -1 minus the integer. So
right.
I think fundamentally people in this situation would need that number, regardless. So
fair enough.
Yeah, let me just add a note that says, consider adding a generic. Generic is probably the wrong word here, but like a general.
Yeah, and there's nothing currently defined in CBOR that you can't read until you get to some of the tag types. You just wouldn't know how to interpret them, but you can still read the primitives. So, okay.
So Jeremy, what
another
is this?
reason?
Sorry.
Another reason the ASN reader had the escape valve of just give me the bytes is there were types from the spec that it doesn't support, and so it's like here's the bytes, deal with it yourself.
Yeah, I was to ask, like, what is the API that is the equivalent?
For ASN reader, it is. I just need to see what name we actually ended up on. Peak encoded value.
And it returns the span, or what does it do?
It returns a read-only memory because that's the input type that it took in the constructor.
And it's on ASN reader.
Yeah. I mean, it has peak encoded value and peak content bytes, and then read encoded value. But content bytes makes more sense in there than here, where everybody can obviously tell I'm pointing at that monitor. Yes.
All right. Byte strings.
Byte strings. Okay, so byte strings, major type 2. Again, the most basic method here is read byte string, which just returns a byte array containing the decoded data. One important feature of this method to note is that if it encounters an indefinite length string, it will actually concatenate the values into an equivalent into a well, into the corresponding concatenated byte string.
Interesting. So I have no idea what sizes CBOR expects to have, but what happens when you have like a concatenation of logically like 1 terabyte, but it's like at 4K chunks?
Well, I mean, that would have been certainly a concern if we were reading from stream. But given that we don't do that, I wouldn't
I see, because
consider
the
it
input
being
data
that
already
big of
has
an
to
issue.
be in memory as a flat
Yeah.
buffer. Yeah.
Exactly. I guess this is one of the reasons why this implementation has, moved very much away from supporting stream at all, because of those features.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And byte string is just CBOR speak for byte array, right? It's just they happen
Correct.
to use string. Yeah.
Yep. Then there's an equivalent method for writing the data into a buffer that you own, following like the standard shapes. Again, exactly the same semantics. If it encounters an indefinite length string, it will write the concatenated byte array string into your buffer. But if actually you wanted to just treat an indefinite length string as an array of definite length strings, then there exist a couple of methods called read start byte string and read end byte string, and where you can actually consume the individual chunks of the indefinite length string. That particular method will fail if you're trying to call it with a definite length string.
Why would that fail?
So basically, just as a reminder, indefinite length strings are just arrays that must contain definite length strings of the same type. So that basically is the same as pushing a context for reading an array of byte strings. If you're trying to do that when you have encountered, in fact, a definite length string and not an array of strings, then it will fail. Because it is effectively a different type.
Right. So another way to think of it, Emo, is indefinite is byte array. Definite is byte array. And the I want to read a byte array understands that it can just call concat on the byte array segments.
Yeah, I guess my mental model might be wrong, but like I thought of this API kind of this span version of the previous one, but that seems to be not the case then.
Oh, that is the case. I guess I was referring to the last two methods in this block.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was still parsing the previous one. I guess so the question with the previous one is then, if it is a definite sized byte string, how would I know the size up front?
Good question.
Well, that's why there's a try read without just a span filling non-try.
Yeah, trial and error, I guess, or allocate a buffer that is at least as large as the data that you supply the reader.
Yeah.
So what was the one that you just mentioned, Jeremy? Like, I mean, if I just call try read byte string.
Right. So the absolute upper bound for try read byte string is going to be the total number of bytes left in the payload, because it could be or -1. It could be that it's everything after the first byte is this 1 byte string. That's the upper bound. The expected value can be anywhere between 0 and that. And so unless we add a method that lets you ask ahead of time how big would it be, this just really falls down to the hope and pray or ask for the allocating one. There's not a good middle ground in it.
Well, but I mean, if it's a definite sized byte array, then we could have an API that gets you that length, right?
Yeah. So I was actually gonna ask, based on what I did for ASN Reader, of does it make sense to have a method that returns the span of a definite only segment? So, read definite byte string, or read byte string definite, or something that returns, here's the span or the memory or whatever of this is exactly the stuff I found. You get a 0 copy thing to deal with, and now it's yours, which would make a lot more sense for using the read start byte string and read end byte string, because then you get the segments yourselves to copy as you see fit.
Yeah, I suppose some people might find it beneficial.
That's
Yeah.
a very PC way of saying I don't care.
I mean, the name would need to indicate that it only works on definite byte strings.
One thing to note is that this would really only work for byte strings. There wouldn't be an equivalent in text strings, obviously.
Wouldn't there? Because the rules are you can't split between a multi-byte character in the segments. So all the read-only span of bytes of UTF-8 data would be semantic, or you could even make it read-only span. I guess you couldn't make read-only span of char because you're gonna have to decode it, but it could return a read-only span or read-only byte of the encoded bytes. Yeah. So what I have on ASN Reader, just for comparison, is like try read primitive octet string, which only works if it's the primitive which is closest to definite in this case, and then that outs the contents. But in my world, it's generally someone's more likely to know that they expect an octet string here, and like whether it was going to be definite or not is hard to tell. I mean, they can look, the data's there. So it's a question of, in CBOR encoded things, if the spec says there's a byte string here, and so someone was going to write blind code without doing the peek, so that's why I have the try of all that it says in the data language is there's an octet string here, and it's up to the writer if they encoded it in definite or in my case primitive or constructed.
Would it be an issue if it just threw an exception, because you can still determine that from the peek method?
Yeah, I mean, so it would be fine. It's just a question of how you would expect people to write the code, and certainly we could come back and backfill it with a try later if people complained. I was just looking through a bunch of places where I use the ASN Reader, and I was looking for all of the segments that I call a try method, and then in the false block have debug.fail. And so it's one of those like, maybe I should have just had read primitive octet string as a do this or throw. And so a similar logic applies here for both either having the true or not having the true. Sorry, try.
It seems to me like in file formats, you generally want a throwing API, because either you have a generic pattern where you can just understand what's next, which is basically what peak state will do, and then the rest is just all unreachable state effectively, right? If you know that you're expecting a certain format.
Well, I mean, the question is, when would you know that you have to see a definite encoded byte string? In my case, it's if you're in dir mode. I think here, if you're in CTAP2 canonical,
right,
you know it's never going to be an indefinite byte string. And so you could just straight call the throw if this is not right, because it was going to throw anyway. Give me the next definite encoded byte string.
But that's what his APIs do, no? I mean, if you call the wrong one, you will get an exception.
Right, but right now, if you call read byte string or try read byte string, they work for both definite and indefinite. So this would be adding adding something that only works for definite and doesn't work for indefinite.
I see. Well, I guess would you care in that case? I mean, if you can call an API that will work for either case, why would you go out of your way to throw for that?
Well, read byte string is, the current read byte string is allocating. Try read byte string is copying and has you theoretically need to deal with return false, or rather you should deal with if it returned false. And then this other API would be, give me the read-only memory like give me the 0 copy projection, and if you couldn't, throw.
And the couldn't here is really it's the wrong format, not you don't have
Right.
enough buffer size because you don't pass in the buffer to begin with.
Right, but in a generic CBOR lax document, you couldn't call that method with confidence. You'd either
Right.
have to call peak state, or that you're going to call it assertively, and in a catch block you're going to call the allocating one.
Right, but I mean but the peak state is the way to call it safely, right? I mean that's the general pattern for
Yes.
all the other APIs. So like I don't
I
think
have
that's a problem.
I have a question. I might be misunderstanding the use cases here, but if it actually gave you back a memory projection of the actual data, like in a typical use case, wouldn't you still copy data from that memory into something else?
You might be able to directly pass that into some other parser without copying it
Okay.
into another intermediate buffer.
But even if you were to copy, right, the key thing is you already have the data that you want to copy, right? Whereas the other one, you still have to figure out what to do with it.
Because essentially having the one that returns the read-only memory has also solved the how long is it problem, where you now don't need to do a grow loop. It's give me the segment. Oh, wow, that's way bigger than I thought. Go ahead and resize to be big enough to hold it.
Yeah. But I think Jeremy's right. I think most of the time you're probably not holding onto the bytes. You're probably using those bytes to something else, and that's the something else you hold on to. So the initial copy is probably not that useful.
So,
I mean, the only
right,
downside
so-
of Jeremy's approach is you're really tying now the current design constraint, which is that CBOR reader only works on a flat buffer to begin with, is now part of the API, right? Like if you ever wanted to support a stream one, then we're fucked with that API.
I think a stream one would just be a type that wraps this,
A type
and then it
that-
would simplify, like it, or it would simplify and say that it's not, like, so you would make CBOR stream reader.
Yeah, I think
It
it would
then-
have to be a separate thing.
I
It
see.
then wraps a CBOR reader, and it would just never expose a method like this because it doesn't make sense for stream.
Yeah, I mean, all I'm saying is that that's the implication, right? If you ever think of you can make it transparent, like just add a stream constructor to the CBOR reader with some work in the implementation, that definitely won't work once you expose this API.
Right. Or it would throw an invalid operation exception. I don't work if you gave me a stream.
Yeah, which, yeah,
It's
I guess
unfortunate.
that's fair, yeah.
Yeah, so now the question would be for this thing, is it infix or suffix? With ASN, I couldn't, like, read octet string primitive kind of would have worked, but it felt weird. So I put the primitive, in your case, definite, but as a prefix. So I guess an infix. So it read definite byte string, returning a read-only memory of byte. It does break IntelliSense grouping, but it makes more sense to me than read byte string definite.
I mean, does it have to be that? I mean, you could imagine having an API that gives you effectively a list of memories, right? And then it would work for
could,
both
but I-
cases. And then you could just say the other one is, yeah, basically just a singleton version of that.
That would probably be suboptimal for our primary use case, which is canonical modes.
Because canonical basically only deals with definite.
Yeah, I mean, like, it could return read-only sequence, but I don't know that I don't know where that's going to be in terms of layering here, or if that's really helpful to people.
How pain of the ass is the sequence? And it's also virtual allocation free in case it's a single segment, right? There's no additional cost, right?
I think that's true. It is a relatively large struct, even for single segment, but it doesn't have heap allocations at single segment. But I think that if someone wanted to do I guess I would expose it as getting just the one segment, and if later somebody wants to get it as a sequence, we could do that, but that means that the one segment one does need a hey, I will throw sometimes name.
Yeah, I guess. How would you call it?
Because it would be read, because I guess the problem is the sequence returning one would be read byte string paren, which currently returns byte array. But so read definite byte string or read byte string definite or whatever could return the memory, and now it's distinguished from the one that allocates the array and returns it for you.
And so the signature of this guy would just returning you read-only memory of bytes?
Assuming we're doing it as a non-try, yeah. Where the answer
sorry, yeah.
for the try state was call peak state and make sure that you have the definite encoding.
Honestly, I would probably not have a try. I would probably just say read definite byte string, because all the try, like, I think the only tries here that make sense are things where you have buffers. Everything else is a formal violation. You shouldn't have called the API to begin with.
Would you perhaps expect that we should maybe use read byte string for that particular method and use a fancier name for the concatenated version that returns byte array?
I mean, the byte array one works for both cases, right? So, like, it seems like that is the simple thing. I mean, the other one is already more involved because now you have to deal with read-only memories, so you need to know what to do.
But I think the defining feature of these two methods that we're discussing is not the return types. It's mostly about, the way that in which they read the data. So I think concatenation is an important thing that might not be noticed from casual users of the API.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a part that I would have to defer to somebody who's ever worked with Seaboard data. But I can say with ASN, all that it says in the data definition language is the next value you will read is, I'll use ASN terms, an octet string. But depending on the particular encoding semantics that you're going with, that octet string can be a constructed, which is the same as indefinite here, or a primitive, which is the same as definite here, and either of them is legal in context. So if you were just writing a flat call and you're like, I don't care, just give me the thing, then like it says there's an octet string, give me an octet string, and I know that maps to a byte array in .NET, so be a byte array. And so that's what I went for in the ASN reader, which is the simplest operation, just matching the DDL, is that read a byte string, return it as an array. Understanding what the encoder chose to do of is it a primitive, constructed, definite, indefinite, whatever, is up to the reader, and the reader has to deal with that problem.
Right.
If they want to get fancy and high perf and don't copy things, then that's not the easy to use path. So it should be the more wordy, et cetera thing. So
right.
Usually we say the thing that kind of just works and is the easiest to approach gets the best name.
At the expense that you usually allocate, right? Because that's just the price you pay for that.
Yeah, if we wanted to bring read-only segment into the world or into this universe, then we could have read byte string that returns read-only segment, and then that has .to array if you wanted to do that, but that's less friendly, and I don't know that it really matters to most people.
Yeah,
So
I kind of feel that I think that might be a good idea, because the concatenating implementation, in a sense, loses information, because presumably an indefinite length, the way that the indefinite length string is chunked might convey information that is lost in this case.
I mean, right now you have no way of getting it, correct? That's, I think, the bigger problem, right? If there's a way to get it, and that API has more characters, that seems fine. But I would also agree with Jeremy, like, based on experience, I would say the vast majority of people probably don't care.
There might be an issue with your mic when you moved it.
No, I think it's just CPU again. I'm running out of encoding speed. Is it ugly to listen to? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, you're artifacted.
Yeah, that's welcome to my CPU usage. I am dropping 30% of frames apparently. Yeah, I think the key here is, like, you don't have a way to get the list of chunked segments, right? That would be nice to do. But if you have it, then seems fine.
Well, that should be possible via the read start byte string and read end byte string methods. Like then you can actually traverse the individual chunks once you've pushed that context into the reader.
Oh,
right. Well, so
yeah,
that's if we leave the read start byte string and read end byte string as they are, and we add a member of reading the one definite byte string. So if we added read definite byte string that returns read only memory of byte, then now you can walk all the individual segments in a indefinite.
And then we could perhaps remove the read start and read end methods altogether.
Well, but how would you go from the next thing, this next marker is indefinite byte string, to I'm accepting that, and now I want to start getting the individual segments?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Well, so there's two different approaches that you could do for indefinite. One is read start, read end, and read definite. Mm-hmm. So then you say, oh, I accept this is an indefinite encoding, read start, and then while the state is not end byte string, read definite, or while the state is a definite byte string called read definite. And then you get all the individual segments, you apply on all the segments the way that you need to, and you move on. Or you could have something that returns read-only sequence, which gives you all the individual pieces in one shot, and then you don't need the start and end byte string.
Right.
Or you could do both, but I don't know that both really matters. And but I don't remember where read-only segment lives in our layering world, or what needs we might have for this later. So I don't know if it's complicated to take a dependency on read-only sequence here, and it's also not a particularly friendly type. And so it's, if caring about the indefinite encoding is already going to be rare, and then fine. I think that probably the most common thing that people would do in general is they're going to call the byte array allocating read byte string.
Right. That's why I kind of like the approach to say the only APIs we leave is read byte string, read start byte string, read end byte string, and then we add read definite byte string, right? And this way you can say, if you don't care, you just call read byte string. It might allocate, right? Or no, it will allocate for sure, no matter which path you're going through. And then the other one is like, yeah, if you want to get the definite one, then if you're standing on one already, then just call read definite byte string. And if you're standing on an indefinite one, then you have to walk it with read start byte string and read definite byte string and read end byte string. But then you basically can always have a non-allocating walk over the byte strings, right?
Yeah. And but someone could write the sequence one in terms of that.
Right. But then also means we don't need try read byte string at all.
Well, try read byte string does fill a different niche, which is you already have a destination buffer that you hope is big enough, and it may have been definite or indefinite, and you want it to just copy all the pieces.
But what I'm not
we can make you.
But isn't that, if I get just read the read only bytes, I can just call copy on that, right?
If it's definite. If it's indefinite, now you have to write the loop yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So try read byte string would also work for the other one. I see.
Right. Like read byte string, the byte array one, I believe, is effectively allocate a byte or count, allocate the byte array big enough, call try read byte string, return and ignore the return, because I promised it was big enough already.
Gotcha.
I mean, writing the loop yourself shouldn't be that difficult, and it isn't very different than what is going under the hood in the try read byte string method anyway.
That's fair.
Yeah, I guess my only feedback is we should probably add read definite byte string, because that like if without having that, you can't actually walk this in a non-allocating fashion. Sorry, in a non-copying and non-allocating fashion.
My only misgiving is I was kind of hoping for a better name.
Better name than read definite byte string?
Yeah.
I don't think it's bad because it kind of means it's not read byte string, right? It's something more special, and it's the word from the spec, right?
Well, technically it should be definite length, but I'm sure people will understand what it means.
Oh, sure. Like if you, I mean,
Yeah.
I would just put the word definite somewhere in there.
Yeah. Okay.
That seems like an important distinction. All right. I think we discussed this to death.
Well, I mean, you'll be glad to know that major type 3 has essentially the same shape, but it only deals with UDF-8 strings. So you have, again, the allocating variant called read text string, which just returns a string. I removed the comment here, but it will additionally format exception if the underlying encoding is not valid UTF-8. There's again, the behavior here is concatenating as defined in major type 2. So if you have an indefinite length text string, it will concatenate all the chunks into a single string. Try read text string behaves like try read byte string. So again, it will copy the characters to the buffer that you provided. If it is an indefinite length string, it will concatenate the results. Well, write them in sequence rather. And then you have the read start text string and read end text string methods. Again, if you want to sort of manually walk through the individual chunks of the indefinite length text string.
So it sounds like we would like to have something like read definite length text string that returns the read-only memory of char then.
Well, but that doesn't make any sense.
Why would it not make any sense?
Because it would have to allocate an array of char in order to have a destination for the UTF-8 decoder to write into in order to turn the bytes into chars. So if we want the non-allocating version, it would be read definite text string bytes.
So why would it have to be bytes?
Because that's all the reader knows. They're bytes that it needs to throw at UTF-8 encoder or UTF-8 encoding to get to turn the bytes into chars.
So maybe I'm remembering wrong, but I thought we could basically give you a read-only memory of char even if the input was a byte array. No?
I mean, we can certainly ascast it, but that's not how UTF-8 encoding works.
Oh, because you still have to transcode it. I see what you're saying. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. Right. So the underlying data is UTF-8, and what we're returning is UTF-16. So we have to transcode it or say that we're returning it as the bytes instead of as the string or the.
I see. And so the try read text string is not just the loop; it also does the transcoding.
Yeah.
So basically, you're looking to add a row method for text strings, basically.
A what?
A row method that just returns the row bytes of the encoding.
Yeah, which is UTF-8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how would you call this method then, Jeremy?
I mean, again, based on words that I threw at the ASN reader that our eyes had all glazed over by the time we got to them, I'd say it would end up being something like read definite text string bytes, which returns read-only memory of byte. We could also call it read text string bytes, but it's weird that read text string works on definite or indefinite, but read text string bytes only works on definite.
I mean, would it make sense to include UTF-8 somewhere? Is it guaranteed to be UTF-8 or?
Well, by the spec, it has to be UTF-8.
Then maybe read definite text string UTF-8 seems fine too, right?
Sure, but I think it would need a suffix indicating like I'm giving you like this is unprocessed byte data.
Row?
Well, the reason why I'm saying like, so I guess it depends, right? So for example, if we add UTF-8 string, right? What would we have a read text string UTF-8 method that returns UTF-8 string? Probably.
It's conceivable that we could add this in the future.
And so in that case, reusing the UTF-8 suffix here would make sense too, to say read definite text string UTF-8, and it gives you a read-only memory of byte, right? I mean, it's a bit unfortunate, but we don't have, I think, a non-allocating version of read-only of UTF-8 string anyway, right? It probably remains to be some version of read-only memory. Maybe not byte.
Well, I mean, there's
if you get a different data type for that, but
there's theoretically, read-only span of, or read-only memory of char8, but I don't know where we've landed on that one.
I think last I talked to Levi that was canned, but I could be wrong.
I still want it.
I think everybody wants it. Nobody wants to pay for the price, though. Like that's the.
Is the distinction of validated UTF-8 versus unvalidated UTF-8? But
yeah, I think the question is if you say bytes, what's your expectation? Like your expectation is the data already is UTF-8, so you're not going to do any work to validate it's UTF-8, right? You're just wanting to, like, at most you want to pay the transcoding cost.
Right, so you'd run it through the UTF-8 encoding of your choice, either the throwy one or the replacement char-y one, and then you.
But should the reader be validating the payload before returning the bytes?
I guess if you say UTF-8, yes. If you say bytes, then no. I guess that's fair.
Well, that's so string, for example, has no requirement today for it to be valid UTF-16. You can encode arbitrary characters, arbitrary U-shorts essentially in your string, and until you pass it through an encoding API for it to be validated, it's still a valid .NET string.
Well, but I guess that's fine. But I think the question is, you constructed the string at that point, right? And so you're, of course, the person that fucked it up then. But like, if you get it from something else that already is processing some sort of format, then the question is, what's the expectation for the return types? And I think if we say we give you a UTF-8 encoded string, then it better be UTF-8 encoded, right?
Right. I mean, there would be a question of the CBOR in the chunking, if I recall correctly, is nice and it breaks at, I'm going to say a word, glyph. No. Code points. It breaks at code point boundaries. So if something is a code point that turns into 3 bytes in UTF-8, they can't be in different segments. They have to all be in the same segment. So it does have some sort of, the spec says there's a little bit more structure here than this is just the byte arrays chunked however we feel like it and tagged as 3 instead of 2.
So why does it need to be in the same segment? Since even if you have a valid multi-byte character in the segment, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have all the contextual information to know that the glyph and how it should be interpreted is correct.
Because it's what the spec says.
Okay.
Of course, now I want to know is what happens if I'm an attacker and I send something that's deliberately fucky uppy.
Fucky uppy.
Yeah, I love
if I remember from code review, right now the read text string and try read text string will throw if it hits a break boundary.
Okay,
like
good. That's what I wanted to hear.
The question is, if we expose a read-only memory of byte of the raw data, does it gain the same validating that it ends in a legal code point, or do we say it said bytes, it's your problem, deal with it?
You know what I would like to happen, and I know that's probably not what anyone really wants to happen. I would like it to go, hell no, this ain't legal. We validated it for you, and you can't have it. However, I would guess that most people who want raw bytes think they know better, and they're like, oh yeah, no, sure, we'll validate it ourselves, even though no one ever will.
Right. Well, really, that's because .NET 1 was bad, and the encoding.utf8 is the replacement char encoding instead of the yell at you encoding. But
oh, believe me, I tried the yell at you encoding and I lost that argument.
Yeah. So, but like the question here, I think, really determines what sort of suffix it gets, right? If we say UTF-8 as the suffix, I think the onus is on us to make sure it's legal. If we say raw, then maybe that is escape hatch of a non-conforming document that didn't meet the rules of indefinite encoding with proper segmentation. If we say bytes, I think we're allowed to be flexible on what we do. So it's all about what behavior do we want, and then what name do we do with it. And so it sounds like Barry is happiest with we stick read definite text string UTF-8, and we run it through encoding.getCount to make sure that it's legal before we return the read-only memory.
Yes, please.
I feel that it should respect the conformance mode, regardless of what overload you're calling. So,
but the segmentation is about or from the lax mode, right?
yeah, so lax mode will not perform these types of validations.
Well, sorry, but I mean, lax mode says you have to end. You can't break a character into two different segments. Or is that only from strict?
So that's only for strict mode and canonical modes, obviously.
Okay, so yeah, so we should respect the mode, and then I guess maybe that means we're saying it's bytes because in lax mode it's not guaranteed well formed.
That works for me.
I thought it was part of the basic well-formedness that a character couldn't be segmented. But if it's only part of restrictive modes, then we should respect that in the restrictive modes.
The spec itself is conflicted in that, because at one point it says that, oh, well, actually that should be the case, but then in another point it says that, oh, strict mode actually, like UTF-8 should only be validated in strict mode, and certain implementations might choose to ignore that.
Certain implementations, but we could be one of the certain implementations that doesn't do that. because you know, doing the right thing has never bitten us in the ass before.
I mean, we could also do the following. We could also just say, let's go with read definite text string UTF-8, do the validation regardless of the mode, and if ever somebody complains about perf, we can still add read definite text string bytes that doesn't.
You mean when David complains?
Which seems unlikely because I don't think that we use this thing on a hot path anywhere yet, right? So
no, this is, I mean,
until HTTP4 adds C4 as the way that you encode headers.
And that's fine. We can still. I mean,
I need you to go outside and I need you to wash your mouth out. Yeah, this isn't really a hot path, so I'd rather have validating. Mainly
Right.
because I'm going to end up using this, and it's for security stuff. So
Even if lax mode is not the default.
Well, no, it's for this is for the FIDO stuff. So this is that's your third encoding anyway. So
Right. Well, because I think CTAP2 canonical says you can't have an indefinite length string. So none of this even really matters to you. But yeah.
So what is
I like
this?
CTAP2 canonical.
So what does this guy validate then? It validates that you cannot break characters or co-points of, I guess, characters, whatever the fucking word is, across different segments, right?
Each chunk is a valid UTF-8 string.
Okay, we'll validate that each chunk is a valid UTF-8 string.
So instead of the replacement char of you see the first byte that identifies itself as I'm a 3-byte encoding, and then it's immediately followed by I'm a 3-byte encoding instead of the 2 further content bytes. Instead of replacement char, you get this is broken bozo, and it throws an exception.
Please make this the text.
PM said it was okay. Ship it.
I was arguing for developer auto skill exception for a long time, but for some reason people don't want this.
We call it invalid operation exception.
Yeah, I know, but it's not as catchy. All right. Arrays.
Arrays. Okay, so here you have two methods, one for pushing the array context and one for popping the array context. The return type is a nullable. In the read start array method, the return type is a nullable integer, and as you would expect, if it is inhabited, it denotes that the array is of definite length, and if it's null, then it is indefinite length, and you have to while loop while peaking. The exceptions that might get thrown here are exactly the same as all the other read methods, so nothing of note here. Obviously, if you're trying to read an indefinite length array while your conformance mode is CTAP, then it will also throw a format exception. And similarly, read end array is just a method that pops the array context. Yeah, that's about it.
Makes total sense to me.
Yep.
I guess maps is the same.
Maps is exactly the same. Again, making the point that you made during last week, Emo, the return value here denotes the size of the map, which is the number of key value pairs, rather than the total number of data items within this context.
Yeah, that's yeah, you have to know that.
Okay. So then major type 6, which is basically tagged data items. Quick reminder, a tag is a data item that encapsulates another CBOR value, and it is essentially used to assign meaning to the encapsulated value. So a string tagged with the number 0 denotes a datetime string, or an integer tagged with the number 1 is a Unix time string, etc. So first of all, this block defines the basic methods for reading the next tag and doing nothing else. So read tag returns a CBOR tag enum. It behaves exactly the same way as the other read methods. And then interestingly, I've also exposed a peek tag method that again returns the same tag without advancing the reader state. Now, the reason why I did this is typically when you read semantically tagged values, those readers would need to consume the tag as well. So in cases where the schema is unknown to you, you might want to determine the tag without consuming it so that you can dispatch to the appropriate reading implementation.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Then the remaining read methods implement particular semantic encodings as defined in the CBOR spec. You have read datetime offset, which reads datetime strings. There's read Unix time seconds, which again returns a datetime offset. There's big integer, which returns big integer. It's the known as the big num encoding in the CBOR spec. And finally, read decimal, which is the decimal, which reads the CBOR decimal fraction encoding.
And they all read strings, right? Sorry, they all read a tag plus a string.
No, it can be anything. So it's a tag and then, arbitrary nestedness inside. It could be like a large map or what have you. So for example, big
Unix
integer
times a number, right?
Yeah, correct. It can be either a number or a float. Well, number regardless. So integer or float. A big integer, for example, is an array containing. No, I'm wrong. Decimal is an array containing the mantissa and the exponent.
Gotcha.
Well,
Okay, so they, but they
And
all.
big integer is the byte array of the big Indian encoding, I thought.
Yeah, so actually the unsigned big integers have one tag and the negative big integers have a different tag, and follows much the same schema as, small integers.
So how do I know that read, in32 does not consume a tag, but read decimal does?
So if you do read in32 in a tag, you will get an invalid operation exception. So the major type needs to be 7 for for either the read tag or the peek tag operations to succeed. So if you call peek tag and the underlying type is not a tag, it will throw.
No, I didn't mean like in terms of what happens at runtime. I'm saying semantically, right? The net developers think of like decimal or uint or int as kind of primitive types, right? So like
Right.
basically my question is, how does somebody know that when I call read decimal that I'm supposed to stand on a tag? That's not basically what I'm trying to get at is, it seems you have some APIs that effectively say I read some amount of primitive data, but in order for me to do that, I also have to stand on a tag. So maybe instead of saying read decimal, maybe you say read tag decimal or something like that, right?
Maybe. So the difference is integer types are defined in CBOR as primitives, and decimal is defined in CBOR as interpreted. And so
right.
If you were looking at something that said there's a CBOR decimal here, then the encoding would say that it has to be tagged, because that's the only time that CBOR understands a decimal. Is I'm writing some stuff down. Hey, by the way, this represents a decimal value.
Right.
So this is because you understand the encoding and the data definition language, as opposed to something like JSON, where it's all sort of kind of loosey-goosey and things do things.
Yeah, I guess I'm just asking, like, does it make sense to also have an API ship that reflects that?
We could have omitted it.
Yeah, we could put tagged in all of these read methods. I mean, not read tag. Well, technically you can read a tag, but if we want to say it's read tag DTO, read tagged Unix time, read tagged big integer, and read tagged decimal, because you think it conveys more information than that.
I don't think it necessarily disambiguates, though, because there's no other form of Unix time or big integer
Right.
or decimal.
Yeah, I guess for things like datetime offset and decimal, it's just that the naive .NET developer will not understand that this requires a tag in the input.
Well, but the
reading the
state
docs.
that you, assuming that I remember right, the state that I think you need to be in for this is you would say reader peak state, it will tell you tag.
Right.
And then you say reader peak tag, and it will say decimal. And then you say, oh, read decimal. And then that reads the tag and the value and moves on to the next thing. So you didn't need to work with the tag other than having the second switch.
Assuming you don't know what the schema is, but if you know what the schema is, you can skip those two steps.
Yeah.
But I think that the point here is that in the equivalent write methods, the tag will be written for you. So, like if you call the write big integer method on the writer, then it will prepend the appropriate tag, per the CBOR spec.
Yeah, I guess I mean, whatever we do here, we should probably make sure that it's the equivalent side on the other end of it, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So if we believe that we should prefix it with tag, then we should do the same thing on the writer side. If we believe we shouldn't, then probably what we have currently makes sense.
Yeah, it's fully symmetric. Another point is that major type 6 is completely forbidden in CTAP 2, so you won't be dealing with those readers when doing FIDO.
Yeah. So I don't think that the word tagged needs to really be here, because there's not a difference between a tagged datetime offset and a non-tagged datetime offset. It's simply the rules of CBOR are datetime offset is tagged, or you presented it just as string and you tell someone, by the way, at runtime interpret this string as a RFC 70, nope, RFC whatever, or
7049.
ISO whatever. No, 7049 is CBOR.
Oh, sorry.
The encoding of the string is the ISO.
That one, yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, so I think these are fine as is.
Yep, sounds good to me. Then let's scroll down.
Okay, so major type 7. Again, nothing too interesting here. Reminder, major type 7 can be broken into two separate kinds of values. You have the simple values, which is basically just a single 8-bit tag used to encode, among other things, false, true, and null. And then you have the half, single, or double precision floating point encodings. So to begin with, there's the read simple value method that just returns a seaborn simple value enum. Again, it operates as you would expect. If it encounters a different major type, it will throw an invalid operation exception. If it encounters a floating point encoding, which is of the same major type, it will also throw with the same exception. Then you have the read Boolean method, which does what you would expect with the expected behavior. Read null, which just consumes a null value from the reader. And then you have read single and read double for single precision and double precision floats. Perhaps a thing to note here is that the read single method will throw an invalid operation exception if you're trying to read a double precision float, but the opposite doesn't hold. Like if you do a read double and you encounter a single or a half precision, it will encode those appropriately. Sorry, decode those.
Now that we have an official half type, and it should be checked in sometime this week, should we be exposing read half?
Oh, absolutely. If we do get this, yeah.
What? So I think right now we're only expecting Seaboard to need to be net 5. But Tanner, did half go net standard or net 5?
Net 5.
Okay.
There's no net standard 2.2, so.
Well, but we could have put half in a package targeted at net standard 2.0.
Oh, sure. But that one seems to me almost orthogonal, right? I mean, we could do that regardless, right?
Yeah, I'm just making sure we understand dependencies and versioning, right. And but if we think this is still just net 5, we can do that, and if we have to carve out net standard 2.0, we can split the refs.
Yeah, we can either split the refs or we can ship whatever dependencies we have down level as well, right? So that's. I mean, for half, it seems like it probably would be as easy as hash code, right?
Yeah. Right. So double reads double, single, and half. Single reads single and half, and if we add half, it'll only read half. They're never going to do the truncation for you from more precise encoding to less precise runtime.
Yep.
Makes sense. I'm still kind of sad that read null does not return null.
I mean, it can return object just so it can return null, but there's only one thing it can do, so void seems sufficient.
If you really want to be fancy, you return object, but then the return value is not null, but db null.instance.
I thought you said you didn't have read encoded value.
Ah, yeah. I don't remember the code I've written. So yeah, there you have it.
All right.
Yeah, I was kind of positive that I've only added it for writer, but yeah. So that method basically does what you would expect. It will return a span containing the entire data item and any sub-data items that it contains.
And for indefinite things, it includes the int marker?
Yeah, it includes everything up to the trailing byte if it's indefinite length. So anything necessary for making the read-only span a self-contained seaboard document, essentially.
Yep. Right. So to bounce back a little bit, we could say with this, we don't need the read seaboard negative integer representation method, or we can leave it because it's possibly provides value. But
I mean, given that it's already been written, I would probably leave it.
Yeah, I think it provides a bit of value that for certain applications at least.
That's fine.
All right,
just making sure we agree it's there for the right reasons instead of because there's no read encoded value. So.
Well, it's there for the read reasons.
Those Germans, so funny.
I have always an excuse. My people have no taste of humor, so. All right, the Shiba reader one, the last one, the skip value and skip to parent.
Yeah, so this set of methods basically provide some essential functionality needed to just skip data items that you don't care about. So calling skip value will just skip the data item and all its contents and move on to the next one if there is one. And by default, it will throw any appropriate format exceptions pertaining to either formatness of the CBORD document or conformance mode validation not succeeding. The first method does precisely that, so it skips the next data item. If you disable conformance mode checks, then it will do as you would expect. So it will not validate UTF-8 strings. It will not validate for keys being sorted and what have you. And it's really intended as an escape hatch because specifically the Coskey spec actually mandates that if a Coskey in an array of Coskeys is malformed, then you would need to skip that and decode the next one.
Your comment here says disable conformance mode checks is equivalent to using strict. Does that mean lax?
That was me changing lax as a default, and apparently I changed that comment as well. So that should say lax, yeah.
So I guess skip to current is basically a loop that uses skip value and then eventually calls whatever the pop method is to get to the parent state, right?
So I feel that this method is kind of controversial, and I wouldn't mind if we decided to completely drop it. The reason why I added it is because it comes for free when you implement skip value. What it does essentially is, assuming that you are in a context where you've encounter invalid data, it skips the remaining data items in the current context and pops that context for you.
Right.
I mean, it would also be useful in a map where you are only looking for one key. You found the key, you've read the value, and you're done with it, and it simplifies your drain the rest of this.
Yeah.
I kind of feel, however, that people might not necessarily understand what this thing does. So, part of me says that, if people need this, they might as well implement it themselves using a while loop.
I mean, yeah. I mean, to me, it's like maybe it's just me, but like I think intuitively understood what it meant, so that seems good enough. I mean, I in general I like the idea of skip value because it basically means if you have invalid documents because one of your people you exchange data with happens to have an implementation that is not strictly correct, but is only not correct in one area, you can basically still say I validate anything and then I just skip the one thing that I know is not correct.
Yeah.
And I think that still is super useful.
Yeah, I mean, definitely for skip value. I think another remark I could make here is that the two methods can actually be generalized to a single method that accepts a height parameter. So basically, it tells you how many levels you want to skip. But I find that even more difficult to communicate to users. I think just leaving skip value and deleting skip to parent is fine.
Have you thought about being able to disable conformance checks on the reader temporarily?
Like for everything?
Yeah, basically a property almost in the reader that says enabled. You say false, do whatever you want to do, and then you re-enable it.
I feel that it might be acceptable for skip because you don't actually read the data. I don't know how Barry would feel about doing this for
changing state feels very weird because depending on your level of paranoia, and I think Barry and I are both very paranoid, the moment you pass it into a method, you're immediately going to need to say, I need you to go back into strict mode. So if it is for a single function only, that seems fine. But for changing the mode out of what you built it in the constructor seems inappropriate.
Yep, agreed.
Does read encoded value is that raw? Like it's just the bytes without interpreting them aside from where it needs to for length?
No, they will be validated. They have to be validated.
So maybe read encoded value needs skip as well. So it would let you throw it at a lower validation level reader if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean it is implemented on top of skip anyway, so that should be easy to achieve.
So, yeah, add the defaulted disable conformance mode checks to read encoded value, and then now you can say, fine, this didn't work under CTAP2, but this particular thing that I'm doing is important enough that I'm going to try reading this one segment using just strict and see if I can get the data I want out of it, and then move on. So, and technically someone could do that if they still had the reference to the original input memory and paid attention to the bytes remaining and computed their offsets. Should read encoded value be a span or memory? Seems like memory because it's giving you a slice of what you gave it.
Why would it be memory? I mean, like you.
Well, if it's span, you can't actually now pass it to another CBOR reader because CBOR readers take memory.
Yep.
So you gave the CBOR reader a memory, so it can give
So
you back.
I believe that ASN1 does memory as well, and that's why I use span here.
The reading, so on ASN reader, read. Well, so peak encoded value returns read-only memory.
Okay.
And read encoded value returns read-only memory. On ASN, when I had ASN value reader, that one was span because it was span in, span out.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Now it's ASN decoder. So, yeah,
Yep.
so read encoded value should return read-only memory because that's the slice of what you gave it.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I think then we're done with this type, right? Or
Yep.
with the
Yep.
entire spec, I think.
Any strong feelings about skip to parent?
I'd leave it in. I think
Okay.
it makes sense to me.
Yeah, I can go either way. It's not a complicated loop for someone to write. I think skip to ancestor, which we've discussed, but I'll let everyone else know. I think it had too many fail modes of you've passed in a number bigger than your depth versus you're in a state, and so skip to parent made more sense to me than skip to ancestor or skip with a count, or skip up with a count or any other variant of that. But if you think having written it and used it in some samples and stuff that it's kind of weird and maybe you don't want it, then certainly if you had deleted it from the proposal, I don't think any of us would have suggested it.
Yep.
And then just because it was a thing that came out of me dealing with an ASN reader, do you think that there's need or value in CBOR decoder or CBOR encoder, which is the stateless, very complicated signature? I operate on spans and do things. Or is that just in the future when someone asks for it?
Well, because of the conformance level validation going on, there's a lot of state that needs to be tracked. I think it's substantially more than ASN1 reader. So if you'd have to deal with this manually, I wouldn't see the value in doing that.
Okay. So essentially, you would end up only with the static methods being able to handle like the integer types, and at that point, you don't think it's worth it.
Yeah, because of all the map key uniqueness / orderness guarantees for canonical conformance modes, it means that a reader will typically make many more allocations than just the reader itself.
Okay.
So then I think at this point we can flip the status to approved.
Yay.
And then this is it. Is there an issue for this? No, right? This is only the spec, right?
Yep.
And how about we just merge this guy?
So as Jeremy pointed out, there's a typo, but I can maybe fix it in a future PR.
You can either do that or you can just push directly. Like, I mean, this is not like source code.
Okay. We did also make some changes,
Yeah.
both during last session and this session. But
I mean, in general, the way I see designs is that there are specs, right? And like even for specs, we very rarely go back and make them match the product, right? Because it's an expression of intent, right? And then we have notes that tell you what we want to do with that. And I think that seems good enough. Like, I mean, I see value in specs, but at the same time, I'm also not like I don't know how to say this nicely, but I'm not like a paper pusher either, right? Like I want to have a process that is reasonable, but also not overbearing.
But I guess it goes without saying that the recommendations made today would have to be incorporated.
Right. So that's why we already. So this is other repo that we have here, right? The design reviews. Sorry, not this one. The API reviews. And so, like, I already posted the CBOR one last time, right? So there already is one for round 1.
Yeah.
And so I just updated this one for round 2. And so this one will say approved, and then we will have a video link here. This will saying round 1, and there's a round 2 with the other feedback. And so that's the same thing, right? I mean, when we approve issues, we don't update the issue description either, right? We just say here's our feedback, and then we just mark the issue as approved, and then the issue gets closed, right? We're not going back and edit the descriptions either. So I wouldn't do it for specs.
Cool.
Alrighty, so then anything else, or that's it?
Yay!
While we were talking about the encode method on the writer, the one that returns an int and writes to the span, I said I should do it for ASN writer as well. Does anyone have any objection?
So I say this again. What do you want to do?
So on ASN writer, I had public byte array encode, and I had public bool try encode. And there's the method that tells you how long the encoded value will be, which is get encoded length. But I didn't have public int encode span. So I just want to add the third variant, which according to code that I did this morning removes like 22 debug.fail blocks out of colors of, I already know how big it is. So try encode can't fail.
Makes sense to me.
Cool. Then I will mark my very poorly formatted issue as approved. All right. I think we get to be done early today.
It seems like this. And eventually I will figure out how I can submit a PR right from VS Code. I always use the command line. I don't know how to do it. All right. Then
darn it, I guess I'm gonna have to write some code to make sure that it all works. And get my Fido stuff working.
That would be nice.
Yeah, lots of things would be nice.
Seems reasonable. All right, guys. Then I see you on Thursday. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Emil.
Yeah.